down to the bottom of the hole. I could see the sweat glistening on the hairs of his arm, and the damp impression his shoulder blades and spine made on his uniform shirt. He felt for a pulse, checked for capillary refill by pressing the pale fingernails, and finally manipulated the fingers themselves. Even I could see they were as stiff as wood and clean. If the heavy ring was any indication, it meant we might be dealing with a man of means. Fancy rings are uncommon among Vermont men. They get in the way when you're working with your hands and can be downright dangerous around machinery. More to the point, however, the possibility that wealth was a factor here, and therefore publicity, made me particularly unhappy. The medic got up and shook his head.
"Sorry."
The tone of his voice made me look at him more carefully. His gold name tag said John Huller. He was somewhere in his mid-20s with blonde hair, a fair complexion, and eyes pale and sad. I regretted we'd had to call him and his partner in on this. For them, trying to save lives was often difficult enough. Confirming obvious deaths seemed unnecessarily trite. Unfortunately, that was protocol. I nodded to Huller. "Rigor mortis in the fingers?"
"Yes."
I mulled that over. On average, rigor was complete in 6 to 12 hours, nearer to 6 in this heat, with flaccidity returning in 24 to 48 hours again. The hotter, the sooner. Since daylight seems to inhibit most clandestine gravediggers, I had to assume the hand with the ring, and whoever was attached to it, had been planted last night. "Okay. Thanks for coming." I watched Huller scramble up the embankment. This part of Canal Street crossed what originally had been a broad swale descending from the hills behind us to Whetstone Brook below. Some town fathers, well over 100 years ago, had terraced that gap with an earthen embankment, on which Canal Street had then been built, buttressed by a stone retaining wall on the low side. Unfortunately, engineering arrogance had failed to heed the small spring that was buried under this wide balcony of dirt and rubble, and nature, 3 weeks ago, had finally reasserted itself. The old retaining wall had crumbled from spring-fed erosion, taking a good 200-foot section of Canal Street with it. The people of Brattleboro had become thoroughly riled, not a rarity in this outspoken town, and amid pointed questions as to why the road crew had patched ever-widening cracks in the road over the years without looking for their cause, the Department of Public Works had quickly set about replacing the old retaining wall with a heavily reinforced concrete dam, capable of shoring up an 8-lane freeway. It was on this half-completed dam, or rather the leveled dirt fill packed in behind it, that I now stood with Kluszewski. The dam still had about 8 feet to go before it reached the level of the street above. I took out my handkerchief and mopped the sweat from my brow. From our man-made terrace, we could look down across the brook, over the warehouses lining Flat Street, and the trees interspersed throughout, and up the opposite slope to where Elliott Street was hidden by the town's typically intermixed hodgepodge of residences and small businesses. Despite the openness and proximity of running water, there wasn't the slightest hint of a breeze. The whole lumpy, hilly, topsy-turvy town might as well have been stretched out flat on an Arizona frying pan. "I take it the state's attorney and the medical examiner have been contacted?" Kluszewski let out a small snort.
"You can take it their offices have been notified, and Tyler should be here any minute with his toys."
J.P. Tyler was as close as our police department got to a forensics team. He did what print lifting, photographing, and chemical analysis he could, given the tools and training we could afford. What he couldn't handle we sent either to the state police lab in Waterbury or to the FBI in Washington. Kluszewski was still talking.
"I took the liberty of telling dispatch to round up all the detectives and to activate the night patrol shift early for a neighborhood canvass."
I smiled at that. All the detectives came to 2 besides Kluszewski, Tyler, and myself, who headed the squad. On the other hand, the uniformed night shift consisted of 6 people, including the shift sergeant. Adding them to the 5-man day shift and ourselves would create a good-sized crew for Kluszewski's proposed door-to-door canvass of potential witnesses. I only hoped someone wouldn't knock over a bank at the